My mother-in-law stood on the balcony of the seaside home I had spent 3 years building for my parents. She raised a glass of champagne and laughed. Then she said something that made every person at the anniversary party go silent. Honestly, this place belongs to our family now. We use it more than your parents do. I remember gripping my drink so hard I thought the glass would crack. My father stared at the floor. My mother looked uncomfortable. My wife froze beside me, and my mother-in-law smiled as if she'd just made an innocent joke. But it wasn't a joke. Because 3 months earlier, I had given my parents that house as a gift for their 50th wedding anniversary. I paid for every brick, every window, every piece of furniture. Yet somehow my in-laws had turned it into something else entirely. What happened next exposed secrets, betrayals, and a plan that had been unfolding behind my back for nearly a year. And by the end of it, nobody at that party would ever look at my in-laws the same way again. But what happened before that completely changed my life. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let me take you back to the beginning. I was 42 years old and lived in Charleston, South Carolina. Most people who met me described me as quiet, the dependable one, the problem solver, the guy who showed up when something needed fixing. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't the loudest person in the room, but I worked hard, really hard. Growing up, money was always tight. My father worked construction, my mother cleaned houses. Neither complained, not once. They simply did whatever they had to do. When I was 12 years old, I remember finding my father sitting at our kitchen table after midnight. His work boots were covered in dust, his hands were bleeding, and he was studying bills. He looked exhausted. I asked if he was okay. He smiled and said something I'll never forget. One day you'll have opportunities I never had. At the time, I didn't understand. Years later, I did. My parents sacrificed everything: vacations, new cars, nice clothes, dreams. Also, I could have a better future. And somehow it worked. I earned a scholarship, graduated college, started a small software consulting company, nearly lost everything twice, then finally succeeded. By 40, I had more money than I ever imagined possible. Not billionaire money, but enough. Enough to help the people who helped me. My parents never asked for anything. That's what made me want to give them everything. Around their 49th anniversary, I started planning a surprise. There was a small stretch of coastline about an hour outside Charleston. Peaceful, beautiful, quiet. My parents used to drive there every summer when I was a kid. Mom loved watching the waves. Dad loved fishing. The place held memories. So I bought a piece of land overlooking the ocean. Then I built them a house, not a mansion, not something extravagant. Just a beautiful seaside home where they could enjoy retirement. I spent nearly 3 years planning every detail. When construction finished, I cried the first time I walked through it. Not because of the house, because I imagined my parents living there, finally relaxing, finally enjoying life, finally receiving something instead of always giving. Their anniversary arrived on a warm spring afternoon. Family members gathered. Friends arrived. Everyone expected a normal celebration. Then I handed my father a set of keys. At first he looked confused. Then my mother started crying. When they realized what the keys meant, neither could speak. My father hugged me harder than he had in 20 years. And for a moment it felt like one of the happiest days of my life. Looking back now, I wish I had paid closer attention to someone standing near the back of the crowd. My mother-in-law, Carol. Because while everyone else celebrated, she was watching the house. Not admiring it, studying it, evaluating it, almost calculating. At the time, I ignored the feeling. I told myself I was imagining things. I wasn't. Within weeks, strange things started happening. The first clue came from my mother. She called one evening and casually mentioned that Carol and my father-in-law had spent the weekend at the seaside house. I laughed. That's nice. Mom hesitated, then said something odd. They've been visiting a lot. I didn't think much about it. Why would I? Families visit. That's normal. A few weeks later, Dad mentioned that Carol had started inviting friends to see the property. Again, it seemed harmless, at least at first. Then another month passed, and something changed. My parents stopped talking about the house with excitement. The enthusiasm disappeared. Whenever I asked how things were going, their answers became shorter, vaguer, almost cautious. One evening, I drove down unexpectedly. I wanted to surprise them. Instead, they surprised me. Because when I pulled into the driveway, there were 6 unfamiliar vehicles parked outside. Music was playing. People were laughing. and hanging beside the front door was a sign I had never seen before. A sign that made my stomach drop. It read, "Welcome to the Coastal Retreat." I stared at it for several seconds, confused. Because that wasn't the name of my parents' home. It wasn't even a name we had ever discussed. Then I walked inside, and what I saw made even less sense. Strangers filled the living room. Strangers filled the kitchen. Strangers filled the patio. Meanwhile, my mother sat quietly in a corner, almost like a guest in her own house. Then I spotted Carol. She stood in the center of everything, giving directions, introducing people, acting like she owned the place. The moment she saw me, her smile disappeared. And that was the exact moment I realized something was very, very wrong. What I didn't know yet was how deep it went, or the shocking discovery waiting inside a locked desk drawer upstairs. The moment Carol saw me standing in the doorway, the entire mood of the room shifted. Her smile flickered, just for a second, then it returned, bright, confident, practiced. "Oh, look who's here," she announced loudly. Several strangers turned toward me. I didn't recognize a single one, not one, yet they were walking around my parents' house as if they belonged there. I forced a smile. "Mom, Dad, can I talk to you for a minute?" My mother stood up immediately, too quickly, almost as if she'd been waiting for an excuse to leave. Dad followed behind us. The three of us stepped outside onto the back deck overlooking the ocean. The sun was setting over the water. Normally, the view would have been breathtaking. That evening, it felt cold, uncomfortable. "What is going on?" I asked. Neither answered. Mom looked toward the waves. Dad rubbed the back of his neck. Finally, he sighed. "It's gotten a little complicated." My stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" Another silence. Then Mom spoke quietly. "Carol started bringing friends." I nodded. I can see that." Dad looked embarrassed. "Then she started hosting weekend gatherings." I stared at him. "Hosting?" He nodded. "At first it was just a few people. Something felt very wrong." "How often?" Mom exchanged a glance with Dad. "Almost every weekend." I blinked. "What?" Dad lowered his head. "Sometimes during the week, too." The realization hit me slowly. This wasn't an occasional visit. This wasn't family stopping by. Something else was happening. Something much bigger. Before I could ask another question, Carol appeared on the deck. Perfect timing, almost as if she'd been listening. "There you are," she said cheerfully. Then she wrapped an arm around my mother's shoulder. "We were just telling everyone how generous your son is." My mother forced a smile. Forced. I noticed it immediately, and suddenly dozens of little moments from the past few months started connecting together. The hesitant phone calls, the vague answers, the lack of excitement, the uncomfortable pauses. Something was definitely wrong. I stayed overnight, and around midnight, I found my first real clue. I couldn't sleep. The house felt different, not physically, emotionally. Like it no longer belonged to the people it was built for. So I walked downstairs. The lights were off. The guests had left. Everyone appeared asleep. Then I noticed something strange. A locked desk drawer in the study. The desk had originally belonged to my father. I knew that because I'd purchased it myself. Yet the lock was new, very new. Curious. I tried opening it. Nothing. Locked. I wasn't normally the suspicious type, but by then my instincts were screaming. The next morning I casually asked Dad about it. His reaction shocked me. For a split second, panic crossed his face. Actual panic. Then it disappeared. "Oh, that's nothing, nothing, the oldest lie in the world." I smiled. "What's inside?" Dad hesitated. Then Carol walked into the room carrying coffee, and immediately answered for him. "Just paperwork, paperwork." Again, something felt wrong, very wrong. The following week, I couldn't stop thinking about that drawer, or the guests, or my parents' behavior, so I decided to do something I rarely did. I called one of the neighbors, an older woman named Diane. She'd lived nearby for years. After a few minutes of small talk, I asked a simple question. "How are my parents enjoying the house?" There was a long pause. Then Diane said something unexpected. "Your parents?" The way she said it made my chest tighten. "What do you mean?" Another pause. Then she lowered her voice. "I thought the place belonged to Carol." For a moment I couldn't breathe. "What?" "That's what everyone around here thinks." The room suddenly felt smaller. "What exactly have people been told?" Diane sighed. "That Carol manages the property." The property, not the house. The property, a strange choice of words. Then she delivered the sentence that changed everything. "A lot of people think it's some kind of vacation rental business." I nearly dropped my phone. A vacation rental business. My heart started pounding. "No." Diane sounded confused. "It isn't?" I ended the call 10 minutes later, then immediately drove to the coast. The entire way there, my mind raced. Surely there was an explanation, a misunderstanding, some confusion. There had to be, there wasn't. When I arrived, I found 3 separate vehicles in the driveway. Again, strangers. Again. And when I entered the house, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A woman standing in the kitchen was speaking to another guest. We paid Carol $600 for the weekend. I froze. $600 I paid for the weekend. The woman continued talking. The views are amazing. The other guests nodded. Best rental we've stayed at this year. Rental. The word hit me like a hammer. Rental. I quietly stepped back before anyone noticed me. My hands were shaking, because suddenly everything made sense. The gatherings, the strangers, the signs, the secrecy, the locked drawer, the excuses. Carol hadn't been hosting visitors. She'd been renting out my parents' anniversary gift. For money. Without telling me, without asking permission. And somehow my parents had become trapped in the middle of it. I waited until evening. Then I confronted them. Just mom and dad. No Carol. No guests. No distractions. The moment I mentioned rentals, my mother's eyes filled with tears. That was all the confirmation I needed. Dad looked exhausted, defeated, older than I remembered. Finally, he whispered the truth. It got out of control. I sat down slowly. What happened? Mom wiped her eyes. Carol said it would help with maintenance expenses. I frowned. What expenses? Silence. Then Dad answered. She convinced us the house was costing too much. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The house was fully paid off. The taxes were covered. The maintenance fund was funded for years. They knew that. Or at least they should have. Unless, a terrible thought entered my mind. Who handles the finances? Neither answered. And suddenly I knew. Carol. Carol handled everything. The realization made my stomach drop. Because if Carol controlled the finances, then what exactly was inside that locked drawer? And why was everyone so terrified of me seeing it? That night, I made a decision. I wasn't leaving until I found out. Because whatever was hidden inside that drawer had turned my parents' dream home into something else entirely. And deep down, I had a feeling the truth was far worse than unauthorized rentals. Much worse. I sat in the dark living room long after my parents went to bed. The ocean waves rolled against the shore outside. Normally that sound was calming. That night it felt ominous. Because somewhere inside that house was a locked drawer nobody wanted me to open, and every instinct I had told me it contained answers. The next morning I woke before sunrise. The house was quiet. No guests, no music, no Carol. For the first time since arriving, I had a chance to look around without interruptions. I walked into the study. The desk sat exactly where it had the day before. And so did the locked drawer. I stared at it for several seconds, then noticed something unusual, a small key hanging inside a decorative bowl on a nearby shelf. The bowl had always been there. The key hadn't. My heart started pounding. Slowly, I picked it up, walked to the desk, and slid it into the lock. Click. The drawer opened. Inside was a thick folder, actually several folders. Receipts, contracts, bank statements, printed emails, reservation calendars. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then my stomach dropped. The house had been rented almost every weekend for the previous 7 months. Every weekend. Sometimes entire weeks. Thousands of dollars flowed through accounts I didn't recognize. 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. The numbers kept growing. By the time I reached the final statement, I felt sick. Carol had collected over $68,000. 68,000. Using my parents' anniversary gift, I sat there staring at the paperwork, trying to process what I was seeing. Then I found something worse, much worse, a signed document. At the bottom's my father's signature. My hands began shaking. Because, according to the document, Carol had convinced my parents to grant her temporary management authority over the property. Temporary, a dangerous word. One that people use when they want permanent control. The agreement allowed her to manage bookings, collect payments, coordinate maintenance, handle expenses, everything. And judging from the bank statements, she was handling far more than that. The front door slammed downstairs. I quickly returned everything to the drawer. Seconds later, Carol entered the study. The moment she saw me standing there, her smile vanished. For the briefest moment, I saw panic. Real panic. Then she recovered. "What are you doing?" I smiled. Looking around, her eyes drifted toward the desk, then back to me. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it told me everything. She knew I was getting close. Very close. That afternoon, I took copies of everything, every receipt, every reservation record, every payment statement. I didn't tell my parents, not yet, because I needed answers first. And answers came from an unexpected place, my father-in-law, Frank. Unlike Carol, Frank was quiet, reserved, the kind of man who spent years avoiding conflict. 3 days later, he called me unexpectedly. His voice sounded nervous. Can we talk? I agreed immediately. We met at a small diner halfway between Charleston and the coast. Frank looked exhausted, like someone carrying a secret for too long. For nearly 10 minutes, he barely touched his coffee. Finally, he sighed. I think you deserve the truth. The words sent chills through me. What truth? Frank stared out the window, then lowered his voice. The rentals aren't the real problem. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? He rubbed his forehead. Carol has debts. The room suddenly felt colder. How much debt? Frank laughed bitterly. You don't want to know. I did. And when he finally told me, I nearly stopped breathing. Over $200,000. Credit cards, failed business ventures, personal loans, bad investments, years of financial disasters hidden behind a perfect smile. The numbers were staggering. Then everything started making sense. The rentals, the money, the secrecy, the manipulations. This was never about helping my parents. It was never about maintenance expenses. It was never about family. It was about money. Always money. Carol had seen an opportunity, a beautiful oceanfront home, a trusting elderly couple, and a successful son-in-law who lived an hour away. In her mind, the house wasn't a gift, it was an asset, an opportunity, a solution to her financial problems. The realization made me furious. But Frank wasn't finished. There is something else. Those 4 words made my heart sink, because every time someone said those words, the story got worse, and this time was no different. Frank reached into his jacket, then handed me an envelope, a thick envelope. Inside were copies of emails, dozens of them. I scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. My pulse exploded. Because Carol wasn't just renting the house, she was actively trying to acquire it. Emails to lawyers, emails to real estate consultants, emails discussing ownership transfers, inheritance strategies, long-term control plans. One email contained a sentence I'll never forget. Eventually they'll rely on us enough that transferring ownership will seem natural. I read it twice, 3 times, 4 times, hoping I misunderstood. I hadn't. The plan had been developing for nearly a year, long before my parents even moved in, long before the anniversary party, long before the gift. Carol had been positioning herself from the beginning, studying, planning, waiting. Frank looked ashamed. I didn't know how far she'd gone. I sat in silence. Because honestly, I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt betrayed, part of me felt heartbroken, and part of me felt relieved, because finally the puzzle pieces fit together. But one question remained. How much did my parents know? That question haunted me for days. Then the answer arrived unexpectedly. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, my mother called, crying, actually crying. I had never heard her sound like that. Can you come? My chest tightened. What happened? Her voice cracked. Please. That was all she said. Just please. I drove to the Seaside house immediately, and when I arrived, I found my parents sitting at the kitchen table. The same table where they'd once dreamed about retirement. The same table where they'd laughed, planned fishing trips, watched sunsets. Now both looked devastated. My father slid a document across the table. I looked down and froze. Because at the top of the page was a notice from a bank, and what it revealed was about to expose Carol's biggest lie. A lie so shocking that it would destroy every excuse she had left. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about protecting my parents from losing everything. The document sat between us on the kitchen table. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound came from the waves outside crashing against the shore. I looked down at the notice again, then back at my parents, then back at the notice. Because what I was reading made absolutely no sense. The bank claimed there was an outstanding loan connected to the property. A loan. My stomach dropped. That wasn't possible. The house had been paid for in cash. Every dollar, every invoice, every contractor, every permit. I knew because I paid them myself. There should have been no loan, no mortgage, no debt, nothing. My father looked exhausted. We don't understand. My mother wiped tears from her eyes. The bank keeps calling. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Who arranged this? Neither answered. But they didn't need to. We all knew. Carol. It was always Carol. I immediately contacted my attorney. Within 24 hours, he began investigating. 3 days later, he called. His voice sounded serious. You're going to want to sit down. My stomach tightened. What did you find? A pause. Then, Your parents didn't take out the loan. Relief flooded through me. For about 2 seconds. Then he continued. But someone used their signatures to secure financial agreements connected to the property. The room spun. What? My attorney explained everything carefully. Several documents existed. Documents my parents supposedly signed. Documents granting permissions. Documents authorizing financial activity. Documents approving business use of the property. The problem. My parents had never knowingly signed most of them. Some signatures appeared legitimate. Others looked questionable. Very questionable. I immediately thought about Carol, the meetings, the paperwork, the endless forms she always asked them to sign, the documents she claimed were routine, maintenance forms, insurance updates, property management paperwork. My parents trusted her, completely, and trust can be dangerous in the wrong hands, especially when money enters the picture. For the next several weeks, everything moved quickly. Lawyers reviewed records, banks reviewed accounts, investigators reviewed transactions. The deeper they looked, the worse things became. Thousands of dollars, then tens of thousands, then more. Money flowed through accounts connected to Carol. Money generated from money connected to unauthorized agreements. Money that never benefited my parents. By Christmas, the truth was impossible to hide, and Carol knew it. The confident woman who once controlled every conversation suddenly became difficult to find. Phone calls went unanswered, messages were ignored, family gatherings stopped, excuses multiplied, the walls were closing in, and for the first time, she realized she couldn't talk her way out of it. Then came New Year's Eve, the night everything finally exploded. A family meeting had been arranged, everyone attended, my parents, my wife, Frank, several relatives, and Carol. She arrived looking nervous. For once, no grand entrance, no confident smile, no performance, just anxiety. The moment she sat down, my attorney placed a stack of documents on the table. The room became silent. Every receipt, every rental record, every email, every agreement, every transfer, everything. Carol stared at the pile, then looked away. Nobody spoke. Finally, my attorney broke the silence. Would you like to explain these transactions? Carol swallowed hard. I was helping. The word sounded ridiculous now. Nobody reacted. Because nobody believed it anymore. My father slowly stood. I had never seen him look so disappointed. Not angry, disappointed, which somehow felt worse. You used us. The words landed like a hammer. Carol opened her mouth, then closed it again. No explanation came, no defense, no excuse, because the evidence was overwhelming. For years, she manipulated situations through confidence, through charm, through pressure. Facts are harder to manipulate. Documents don't lie. Records don't forget. Truth doesn't disappear. And that night, the truth sat on the table for everyone to see. Frank finally spoke, his voice cracked. I spent years defending you. Carol looked at him, then lowered her eyes. The silence that followed felt endless. And in that moment, I realized something important. I wasn't angry anymore. Months earlier, I would have been. Maybe even years earlier. But not now. Because anger requires energy, and Carol had already taken enough energy from all of us. What I wanted wasn't revenge. It was peace. My parents deserved peace. Frank deserved peace. Even I deserved peace. So when my attorney asked whether I wanted to pursue additional legal action, I surprised everyone, including myself. I said no. The room turned toward me. I looked at my parents, then at Frank, then finally at Carol. I just want this to end. Nobody argued, because deep down everyone understood the real punishment had already happened. The truth was exposed. Relationships were broken. Trust was gone. Reputations were damaged. No courtroom could create consequences greater than that. Over the following weeks, Carol disappeared from family gatherings. Some relatives cut contact entirely. Others kept their distance. Frank eventually moved into a small apartment near the coast. My parents slowly reclaimed their home, their actual home. Not a rental property, not a business, not an investment opportunity. A home, the place I originally intended it to be. One evening about a year later, I visited them. The sun was setting over the water. Mom sat on the porch reading. Dad held a fishing rod near the shoreline. For the first time since the anniversary party, they looked happy again. Truly happy. Dad noticed me watching, then smiled. What the best part is? What? He looked toward the ocean. The house finally feels like ours. I smiled, because that's all I ever wanted. Not gratitude, not praise, just that, peace. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I realized something. The greatest gift I gave my parents wasn't the house. It wasn't the view. It wasn't the property. It was protecting their dignity when someone tried to take advantage of it. And the greatest lesson I learned was even simpler. Family should never require you to surrender your boundaries. Love should never require blindness. And kindness should never mean allowing people to use you. The strongest thing you can do is calmly stand in the truth and let the facts speak for themselves. Because eventually, they always do. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. I'll see you in the next one.